Okay, can you guys hear me now? Or is it still bad?
It's okay.
Okay, so just repeating what I was saying, this round is going to be requests. Anyone has any objections? Is everyone okay with that? Perfect.
It's all good, yeah.
And so just a quick side note, preference-wise, I'd ask that you guys time each other.
I'm sorry.
And that.
You broke up again when you said that you prefer, right after you said you prefer we time each other.
Okay.
On our end, we can hear you, so we're good.
Okay, for the team that couldn't hear me, I tried turning off my camera. Maybe that'll help. I prefer you guys time each other and that you announce your names, and that's it. Can you hear me?
I just had a quick question on speaker preferences before we started with that.
Yeah, what's up?
Are you cool with like tea, things like that, or would you prefer like much more traditional route? Like, is speed okay? Like,
so preferably slower speaking to where I can understand you, but I mean, I can pretty much flow quick speaking, but if I can't understand what you're saying, I'm not going to flow it. So go at whatever speed you think is reasonable. And then I do prefer like a more traditional round, less shows.
Okay.
Like that.
Sounds good.
Okay, then. Hi, my name is Ksenia Butts. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll be the Prime Minister. I'm just setting up my timer. And if everybody is ready, I'll start my speech. Okay. Starting now. Hello, Judge, and I am proud to affirm that the United States federal government should substantially decrease its sanctions on Petróleos de Venezuela, South America. Going over a couple of definitions, we think our framework should be utilitarianism, i.e. helping the most amount of people, and our definition of decreasing sanctions is simply lowering them to a reasonable amount. The majority of the sanctions on Petróleos de Venezuela are restricting its access to U.S. debt and banks. So we would be removing those, basically making this company more having a higher chance of success and being able to operate more smoothly in the economic world. We'd like to define a couple of stakeholders, also just before I go over my contentions, because I think this will be really helpful for weighing in the end. So our three stakeholders that we'd like you to keep in mind are: one, the United States federal government and the United States citizenry, people inside the United States; two, Venezuela and its population; and three, the international market at large. Now, with this in mind, we're going to prove to you why we benefit all three of these stakeholders and why this should be a clear ballot. So starting with our first contention, it's about saving lives within Venezuela. It's key to understand that Venezuela's economy since, around the mid-20th century has been reliant on Venezuela de Petróleos, its national petroleum company. This means that Venezuela, during its time when Hugo Chavez was its leader, they built all of their social programs and the majority of their economy and banks around the petroleum money. That's how all of them are funded. Since the United States has increased sanctions on them, this has caused Venezuela's currency to plummet. And further, it has made it basically impossible to fund many of these sanctions because fund many of these social programs. As you can see now, we have thousands of people on the brink of starvation and not being able to, and this company not really even being able to properly create access oil because they're not able to gain enough cash because they don't have access to U.S. banks due to these sanctions. What's the impacts of freeing this up? One, you're breathing some money into this economy. With millions of people on the brink of starvation for this winter and not even able to access oil or petroleum to warm their houses in the winter, this is crucial that we are able to provide some sort of relief by removing these sanctions and allowing this company to flourish again. Now, we understand my opponents may go off on the fact that Venezuela has an autocracy and this has been hurting the citizens more. But we're going to respond to this with our second contention, which is talking about the way that sanctions have actually made Venezuela worse and have actually encouraged Venezuela's autocracy instead of helping it. Second contention, talking about that. Two reasons why sanctions actually make oppressive governments worse. One, oppressive government, and this is actually in turn words for us as America, since we want to have more allies and less oppressive governments overall. That's usually what the U.S. message is. So, one, oppressive governments weaponize sanctions to create more distance between them to justify their negative actions. For example, Venezuela has basically said, "Look at how bad the U.S. has been using all these sanctions, trying to starve all these people." They basically throw the blame off of themselves for their poor economic choices onto the United States by saying, "Oh, we're not at fault for any of the bad parts. It's the U.S. that's causing these sanctions." This has created further distance and has allowed the government to escape accountability. Subpoint 2, the fact that this has actually pushed Venezuela closer to other autocracies and hurt its U.S. position internationally. Venezuela, since the start of the sanctions, has become much closer to China, which is, as we know, one of America's largest economic competitors. China is now Venezuela's primary oil supplier, and because they continually invest into Venezuela, even though it's probably not as profitable as other oil buyers, they're doing. I'll take your POI in a second. China continues to invest in Venezuela because they want to maintain that political stronghold in South America. This has made Venezuela one of China's closest political allies, and from the U.S.'s perspective, this is bad because the U.S. wants to gain, political hegemony as well. So, because of that, we see that this pushes Venezuela closer to autocratic governments, which are less likely to encourage potential rebellions or revolutions that could actually overthrow oppressive regimes. Yes, your POI.
Sure. You say right now Venezuela is turning to China as a primary oil supplier. If Venezuela has its own oil and you say that it could help the economy, why isn't Venezuela using its own oil supply that it already has? What is the warrant for why it's turning to China?
Oh, sorry. It's not that it's not gaining oil supply from China. It's selling oil to China. The point is the fact that China has become one of its last buyers of oil because even though Venezuelan oil is so unprofitable right now due to American sanctions, China and other autocratic governments are willing to pay that price because they want to have that sort of political stronghold in South America. So this shows how uniquely our sanctions have actually pushed Venezuela closer to autocratic governments. And now our third contention focuses on the harms to the international world. So we're going to take you through a lynching here. So by making Venezuelan by removing these sanctions, we make Venezuelan oil more profitable, making more likely that other countries would buy from Venezuela. 2 reasons why this is good. One, even though Venezuela is an autocracy, the other primary oil supplier right now in the world is Saudi Arabia and right now particularly Russia. As we know, Russia has been fueling a devastating war in Ukraine, and it has been using a lot of its profits from oil to do this. By making the Venezuelan market more accessible, more countries are likely to switch over to Venezuelan oil from Russian oil and this is better because it is not supporting an active war. Now, we understand the Venezuelan government is not, I'm getting really close to protected time, so I'm not going to take your POI. So, since we know that the Russian government is, although we understand the Venezuelan government is autocratic and has had human rights abuses, is not nearly as bad as the Russian government, which is fueling a devastating war that has caused millions of refugees. This is actively being fueled by oil money. By providing an alternative, more countries are likely to switch over to Venezuelan oil and reduce Russia's economic power. Second subpoint of why this benefits the world, the fact that most of these countries are facing extreme inflation and thousands of people of lower socioeconomic status are not able to afford enough oil from traditional sources such as Russia and America and Saudi Arabia to survive through the winter and are likely to freeze or get extreme damage. You've heard these sort of reports from Great Britain, you've heard these sort of reports from America before. Now, by making Venezuelan oil more accessible, we're giving some relief to a lot of these countries and reducing the devastating effects of inflation in many of these countries by bringing down oil prices internationally. This in turn brings down prices of all kinds of products that are made from petroleum oil, which is pretty much everything, which helps provide some relief to people who are facing economic devastation due to sanctions. So, Judge, now I'm just going to go over some way how we benefit all three stakeholders. One, we show that we benefit the United States international position because United States sanctions actually promote the Venezuelan government, allow them to justify their actions, and push them closer to American political, competitors and autocratic governments. So this hurts the United States by continuing sanctions. Two, this hurts Venezuelan citizens because we see that in Venezuela, we have thousands of people starving directly because they're not able to fund their social programs because this economy, because this company is being handicapped. And finally, the fact that this is hurting the world overall because we are not making Venezuelan oil accessible. Many of these countries are instead funding Russia, buying more oil from Russia, which is funding the war, or they're suffering from the impacts of inflation because they're not able to afford oil accessibly. So for all these reasons, I'm proud to affirm. Thank you.
Perfect. The order of my speech is just going to be moving down the negative contentions and then talking about the affirmative. Is everyone good? Cool. Let's start time Now, we negate. Let's start off with contention 1. We say it's preventing civil war. Before we sanctioned Venezuela, Maduro and Juan Guaido were fighting for control in Venezuela. The United States intervention via sanctions prevented Venezuela from turning on itself because the civilian population was divided on who to side with. Most Venezuelans do not support Maduro, who is the current leader of the Venezuelan regime. The Maduro regime has killed thousands of people, but sanctions are specifically targeted at punishing Maduro. In 2018, Maduro and Juan Guaido faced off, and there were massive protests on the street, and these protests led to political infighting, and Venezuelans now view the United States as doing something to actually fight the Maduro regime. So since we've implemented sanctions, Venezuelans have had more of a positive outlook on the United States, specifically because Venezuelans do not support Maduro, and us putting in sanctions in Venezuela has decreased the chances of civil war in Venezuela because of the two warring factions, but also allowed for a stabilizing force in Venezuela to prevent conflict. We also say that this helps the Maduro regime slowly self-destruct instead of having the people fight for it. United States sanctions are the ones doing the fighting, because before, people took it upon themselves to dismember or disable the Maduro regime, but right now, because of United States sanctions, we've been able to slowly stop the spread of Maduro's power. The impact is that U.S. intervention is seen as doing something and allows Venezuelans to get their political views heard without actually creating violence. People did not take it into their own hands and avoided civil war specifically because of United States intervention, which is really important, because as soon as United States intervention was in Venezuela, especially with sanctions, the other sides didn't see a point in fighting because they knew that the side with the United States would win, so there was decreased political infighting. Sanctions are actually working to decrease the power of Maduro. Contention 2 is climate change. Our argument is simple. Right now, like they tell you, the entire world is turning away from fossil fuels and oil because we all sanctioned Russia for the Ukraine conflict. Almost every single country and most international organizations had sanctioned Russia. There is very few countries trading with Russia, and that's ruined Russia's economy. This is forcing major world powers like the United States and China to switch to renewable energy. Because of sanctions on the Venezuelan oil company, investors throughout the world are not looking for oil in Venezuela right now. But the link is that substantially decreasing sanctions means these investors who aren't looking to Venezuela are now going to turn to Venezuela, which prevents us from transitioning to renewable energy or green energy. This has a few impacts. First, right now is key. The sanctions on Russia are the only reason Canada and other world powers that used to get their oil from Russia and Saudi Arabia are looking towards renewable energy. Look to Biden's infrastructure plan, which put billions of dollars into renewable spending, and he later announced that because of the Russia crisis, we are increasing our spending in renewable energy because we need to be more energy independent instead of depending on other countries. But it's very weak because we could reverse this trajectory as soon as we allow Venezuela to become a player on the global stage. Remember that the only reason why we're switching to renewable energy right now is because of the fact that no other country is really available for us to turn for fossil fuels. But Venezuela decreasing any sort of sanctions on the Venezuelan oil company. Remember, the resolution is literally asking us whether we decrease sanctions on the oil company in particular, means that now we reverse this trajectory and people will just turn to Venezuela. It might be good for the economy in the short run, but the problem is in the long run, we impact out to climate change because we say the green transition is the only thing that can prevent us from burning more fossil fuels, releasing more carbon into the atmosphere. Contention, the third dissad is going to be politics. We say that right now, and Democrats have a high chance of winning because of things like the infrastructure bill and vaccination increasing the chances of well-being and attributing it to Democrats, and the infrastructure bill being a huge success, and how Trump fractured the Republican Party into two. But there's a few links. The first is that the affirmative is politically unpopular and decreases bipartisanship. Republicans right now are extremely pro-sanctions on Venezuela and will hate Biden decreasing sanctions. Historically, Republicans have been pro-sanctions, and this is a huge political move for Biden, which prevents him from being able to have any sort of bipartisanship to pass any policy in the future. The impact here is the fact that we're going to increase the chances of Republicans winning the next elected office, and also increase the chance of authoritarianism, because we've seen in the past, even with Trump and other members of the political right-wing parties, we've seen when they've been in office, we've increased authoritarianism, we've increased hate speech, and we crack down on minorities. Look to the literal abortion bills, bans that have been going on in individual states with Republican Congress makers. It's a violation of human rights. But next, let's move on to the counterplan. We say that the United States federal government should partner with Amnesty International in Venezuela to substantially increase food and medical aid for Venezuelans. My partner will put the text of the counterplan in the chat. Amnesty International was established in 1961, and it defends against authoritarian and corrupt governments, and specifically is in Venezuela. The NGO part is in Venezuela, and it focuses on the rights of women, children, and LGBTQ, and it decreases the violence in Venezuela. There's two reasons why the negative is better at this. First, we solve the entire second contention of the affirmative. All of their arguments about poverty and things like that. If we substantially increase food and medical aid to Venezuelans, we increase their chances of decrease the chances of poverty and also solve back for all of the problems with the oil company. But secondly, the net benefit is that right now, when you have sanctions, you weaken Maduro, and that's the only reason non-governmental organizations are allowed to go into Venezuela. But when you increase Maduro's economic power by decreasing sanctions on their Venezuelan companies, that means that when you're going to see Maduro crack down on these non-governmental organizations, and they're going to be prevented from even entering the country in the first place. We say non-governmental organizations are like one of the biggest hopes for Venezuela right now in actually being able to lower death rates and solve for humanitarian rights abuses, especially since the Venezuelan government is violating citizens' rights. Let's move on to their affirmative case. First, let's start off with their definitions. Sure, we'll evaluate this debate under net benefits, but remember that climate change will always come first under a utilitarian calculus because it impacts the most amount of people, and we say mass death, starvation, and things like that are a result of climate change and even harms to the environment are always going to increase pain and suffering and decrease pleasure. Let's start about their definition about lowering sanctions to a reasonable amount. There is no clear definition for what a reasonable amount is. You should hold them to this. If they make any sort of argument about how they don't access our impacts, it's because their definition is really shifty. There's no actual warranting as to what a reasonable amount is. Then let's move on to contention one. They say that they talk about the economy and they say that it's reliant on the petroleum company and a majority of banks around the world. And since the United States increased sanctions, the Venezuela currency plummeted. Two responses. First, there are alternate causes for why Venezuelan currency is plummeting right now. It's because Maduro is increasing inflation, and that only happens because Maduro's been doing this before sanctions. He literally bought a yacht and boats with printed money instead of giving it to the Venezuelan people. The problem is the leader, not the sanctions. Secondly, they say that people don't have enough cash and that it'll lead to starvation. But we say that you should turn this argument. When you look towards oil companies and things like that, you deplete the resources of Venezuela, which means greedy companies like private investors from the United States can go into Venezuela and use their oil facilities and things like that for their own benefit. It's happened in Kenya with Starbucks, where they literally deplete Kenyan resources by going in, but sanctions prevent that from happening. On contention two about sanctions hurting the people, first, the counterplan solves the entire contention. Secondly, most Venezuelans hate Maduro, which means that even if the Maduro's trying to weaponize sanctions, we say that it's non-unique. Maduro will literally do anything to blame the United States and Western allies, and sanctions, it might be an excuse, but even if you took them away, he would find something else. Then they say that Venezuela is turning to oil, selling oil to China, but you should turn this argument. If the United States started supporting Venezuela by decreasing sanctions, you would isolate us from our other European allies who are against Venezuela and authoritarian regimes, which harms you as the United States perspective even more. On contention three about the international world, first, almost every single country and sanctioned Venezuela, but almost every single country is sanctioning Russia, which means that any arguments about Russia and how they're turning to Russia doesn't make sense. People are already turning away from Russia. Secondly, you should turn the argument because our renewables argument counteracts this. It's a good thing that people are not looking to oil, because when you don't look to oil, you can look to renewable energy. Third, they give you no warranting as to why the Venezuelan government isn't as bad as Russia. Just because Russia invaded Ukraine, we say they're both authoritarian regimes, and supporting one doesn't make the other one any better. We negate.
Okay. Let me just set my timer for. First, an introduction. Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I use she/her pronouns. I'm the member of government. I'll start my time for 8 minutes with a 30-second grace period on my first word, if everybody's ready. And I prefer verbal POIs. Okay. Starting time. Now. So first, let's address their team's first point, which is this idea of preventing civil war. And basically, they're saying that the general civilian population is against Maduro, so the United States sanctioning Maduro prevented civil war. So here's the main issue with that. The fact is that Maduro is currently the president of Venezuela and has a ton of power over the entirety of Venezuela. So you can't really buy the idea that the United States has at all decreased his influence, nor has sanctions actually prevented him from gaining this immense amount of power. Because even though the United States is actively intervening in Venezuela, we don't see actual concrete evidence of of corruption in Venezuela necessarily decreasing. Thus meaning that any potential impacts of this point are completely minute, because again, we see in the status quo with these sanctions that Maduro has a ton of power. So we're not stopping the spread of his regime. Now, for their second point, they talked a little bit about climate change and renewable energy. And first things first, we can kind of mitigate this impact right away by saying, okay, maybe in the long term, switching to climate change stopping climate change by reducing renewable energy could be a good thing. However, that does not at all outweigh the fact that if in the status quo, people are literally dying because we're not buying enough of this not as clean energy source that is oil. However, even though we have that logic outweighing this impact, we can see that the climate change point doesn't actually work out correctly. Because one, we still have major ties to oil companies, for example, in Saudi Arabia, meaning that we can never actually the United States can never actually make the move towards renewable energy. Yes.
Sure. When the United States called Saudi Arabia to look to oil after the Russia crisis, Saudi Arabia literally hung up the phone. So what is the warrant for why the United States is going to turn to Saudi Arabia when Saudi Arabia isn't even supplying us oil right now?
So I believe we are having oil supplied by Saudi Arabia. The United States does use oil from these other countries, and not just that, we have ties to these major companies. Like the United States has relationships with Saudi Arabian oil companies. But continuing, furthermore, what we can see is that the United States hasn't actually implemented renewable energy since the start of Russia's war, right? So ultimately, what this is showing is that the switch to renewable energy isn't actually going to happen. Furthermore, green transition won't actually solve climate change. The United States moving to renewable energy isn't going to be a major contributor to ending climate change, when we instead have to look more towards carbon emissions, which has a much bigger stake, right? So we can actually sort of mitigate this impact. And finally, again, this isn't going to negate the fact that millions of people are going to die in the winter because they don't have enough access to oil, because they don't have access to heat. And furthermore, we can an impact of these million people dying is not only the fact that it's extremely terrible in the short term, but in the long term, millions of people dying is going to have a negative effect towards climate change, because these are people who had the potential to, say, innovate and create and sort of help fight climate change. These people who in the long term could be our next scientists, for example, right? So ultimately, we win on both short and long term. And completely outweigh on this idea of millions of deaths. Now, their next point is this idea about how Republicans support sanctions, and thus this could lead to the Biden sort of, or the Democrats losing power in the government if Biden were to say decrease sanctions. However, what we see is that in the status quo, issues with Biden, people are mad that Biden is not decisive, right? And whenever Biden makes a concrete decision, it is decisive, his popularity rating actually goes up. Why is this? This is because people want to see that Biden is making actual change, even if they don't necessarily agree with said change. So what we can actually see is that based on past precedent, Biden decreasing sanctions will actually help increase his approval. Furthermore, even if Republicans are against this, the majority of Democrats are not pro-sanctioning Venezuela. So he has more of an opportunity of gaining both Democratic vote and also votes of moderate people who want to see him be more decisive. And their next point is this, their sort of, I'm calling it a point, is their counter plan. So let's address the counter plan. Basically, they're saying they'll partner with Amnesty and provide increase aid towards Venezuela. One, we can see that is not something that is, their counter plan isn't very substantive. It doesn't. It might provide a very short-term solution, but as time goes on, this isn't actually going to benefit Venezuela in the long term. It's just going to provide some short-term humanitarian aid, and what we see is that we can provide the same amount of aid because, again, humanitarian aid, humanitarian government efforts in Venezuela do exist. The only problem is that United States sanctions are preventing them. So what we're going to tell you, Judge, is that the humanitarian aid provided by the Venezuelan government should actually be preferred to aid provided by Amnesty, because by preferring governmental aid instead of having foreign companies intervene in Venezuela, that's preferable because it helps to develop the Venezuelan government, as opposed to forcing Venezuela to be reliant on foreign aid. The countries being reliant on foreign aid is going to ultimately be damaging to those countries because it gives too much control over Venezuela. Yes.
you say that the government aid is much better, but right now the government is not giving any aid. So how do you actually get the Venezuelan government to listen to its people and give them aid when the Venezuelan government is the one that's increasing corruption and not giving them aid and stripping them and like making them?
The problem with that is exactly why we want to decrease sanctions towards Venezuela, because government aid in Venezuela is directly tied to oil, right? Humanitarian efforts are paid for by by oil money, because again, furthermore, Venezuela's entire currency is dependent on oil money, right? So these sanctions are preventing direct governmental humanitarian aid from Venezuela, right? But secondly, we can say that actually their counterplan isn't very unique, because what we can see is that we could actually implement a similar humanitarian system in which foreign companies are giving money to Venezuela for aid, right? And we see that happening even, and they made this like sort of a point about how, right? So we can still apply that. We can still give humanitarian aid towards Venezuela in both worlds. Now let's talk a little bit more about our case. So they don't really address our team's first point about saving lives and economic collapse. They simply say that the problem is in the president and not caused by sanctions. However, what we see is that, again, oil is directly tied to Venezuela's currency and humanitarian efforts. So even if the president is corrupt, that's actively preventing Venezuela from creating as much oil as they need for getting funding for oil is still actively hurting these companies. And even if the leader of even if the president of Venezuela is corrupt, that we're still hurting these companies by completely taking out their ability to make oil. Secondly, for our point about anti-West sentiments, they completely ignore our point about how this is increasing China's hegemony, because Venezuela is China's biggest ally in Latin America, right? So they ignore the fact that that anti-West sentiments have actually increased since introducing these sanctions, because it is actively making people starve in Venezuela, thus leading to hatred of the West. And thirdly, for a point on Russian oil, we can see that even if people are already turning against Russia, people will eventually become more reliant on Russian oil because of just this overall oil prices. So thank you, and thus we are proud to affirm.
So sorry, I will start the final speech, the 2NT on the first word. Okay, sorry. Actually, wait, sorry. The order will be our case, and then their case. So I'll start my time now. On Maduro, just because Maduro is a leader doesn't mean that sanctions haven't worked, right? We say that power has decreased, and even if he has power now, it is lessened by sanctions because now he has an obligation to solve back for issues because there's a sanction on his nation, right? They don't adequately respond to civil war argument, right? Our argument is that sanctions are the only thing preventing Guaido and Maduro from fighting and having people pick sides, right? So sanctions are the thing that are stopping civil wars in the status quo. They really don't solve it at all. This argument is really important. They misunderstand it. When you decrease sanctions, we're going to see more conflict and more civil war, right? Okay, then they talk about how like people dying in the winter outweighs. Judge, they frame it under util, and climate change is going to kill us all, right? So under their own framework, we solve back best because climate change is the single biggest impact in this round, right? And we even solve for people dying in the winter. Next, onto the second contention. They say that we have major ties to Saudi Arabia, but Judge, Saudi Arabia government literally hung up the phone on Biden and told him that they wouldn't supply him with oil. Saudi isn't even doing it, and even then, Saudi Arabia doesn't provide us with enough oil, so we're still switching, right? Also, like OPEC also put a restriction, like they're reducing oil barrels by 2 million, so they're reducing 2 million oil barrels. What this is going to mean is that now our nation is going to be forced to actually switch because now it's going to be a lot more expensive to purchase oil. Next, they say that a green transition won't solve climate change and it's all about carbon emissions. But Judge, green tech literally makes carbon emissions zero. We're going to be a net zero country with basically no carbon emissions, which means we still fall back for climate change, right? They say that people will die in the winter, but we say that literally isn't true. They still have the Alaskan pipeline for spawn. They don't give you any numbers on who's dying, but this is outweighed by climate change. And even if you buy their argument, we do say that these NGOs can go back to Venezuela and solve back for the issues, right? They can provide them with food and aid and all those other things. On to the third contention of political ranking. They say that Biden's popularity goes up because people want him to make change, even if it's bad change, right? That makes no sense because that's just going to mobilize the Republicans, right? They misunderstand our arguments. It's not about decisiveness of Biden. Even if they say like the majority of Democrats are not like pro-sanctioned, right? So it's only going to lead to like more Democratic backsliding because and more votes for the Republicans, and this is going to lead to our impacts about more authoritarianism, as we saw with other Republican leaders, for example, Trump, right? So this is obviously a really, really bad thing because they're not solving for this whatsoever. Like most Democrats aren't pro-sanctions. They talk about how it's also going to appeal to moderates, but that's not really true, right? Because because it's going to be like still like less like sanctions, which is going to affect Republicans. Okay, so onto the counterplan. They say that's a short-term solution. Judge, is it really a short-term solution? Their impact is like about like food and aid, and we saw back for that. So they say it won't benefit Venezuela in the long term. So it is a long-term solution for two main reasons, right? Number one is non-governmental organizations will not be able to go in if Maduro's economic power increases, which is a long-term and turns their argument. Number two, government aid is awful in Venezuela because the government does not care about the people. It literally will refuse to give people aid. Even before aid, they didn't give Venezuela any, and Maduro like stripped Venezuela of money. And with sanctions, we can solve back for this, right? NGOs also go in and help people even more. So there's no reason why NGOs are going to be bad for the people, right? Since we're talking about the people in Venezuela, if you really want to benefit them, then the AF is the only side that solves. And number three, they say this counterplan is unique, but NGOs give aid to Venezuela, but that's not our argument. Also, like when you decrease sanctions, non-governmental organizations like Amnesty, which is the only thing that's giving peace in Venezuela, will not be allowed in. Okay, now we'll go into some of the responses that the opponent. Now I'll go to like the AF case. They talk about how like we do not consider saving lives. Judge, is this really true? Our counterplan solves back, as we're now getting these NGOs to go into these nations and give people food. They said that these NGOs should not be welcome because they're going to have an overall negative impact. But insofar as we're saving lives right now in the status quo, you must vote AF. Then they talk about how like a corrupt president is preventing people from producing as much as they need and it's hurting people. Judge, they can switch to renewables. They have no reasons for why renewables won't work, right? Maduro is buying yachts. He's taking government money and buying things to like just luxury items, right? This is decreasing sanctions also means that foreign companies are going to go in to Venezuela and they're going to be further exploiting Venezuela and taking resources out of there, right? So insofar as we actually want to prevent that and actually keep money for the Venezuelans, you can be voting neg because they're just going to allow more foreign investments to come, more foreign companies to come in, take their money and basically sell it and basically sell their oils and stuff. So they also concede that supporting Venezuela like isolates us from allies. Okay. So also like you can extend our points about how like every country has sanctioned Venezuela and the fact that like if we don't put sanctions on this nation, then we're going to be isolated from the rest of the world. Right now we need a unity to fight against like things like Russia's like Russia increasing and like their and like the war and terrorism that they're causing. And the best way to solve back is by voting neg because they don't really tell you about how isolationism is going to be solved whatsoever, right? Okay. Also, they make this. Their arguments here are like people are going to die, which we saw back for one, and they also say like, oh well, fossil fuels are needed for those people right now. All they're doing is proliferating climate change even more. Judge, we need to solve back for climate change because it's going to have the biggest impact in this round. Well, the biggest thing you can vote off in this debate is the fact that climate change is going to kill us all unless we actually solve back for it right now. People are not willing. People are like, first of all, denying climate change. Not only that, which is and this climate change denialism is going to go up even further because if you vote AF, then we're going to see Republicans win the midterms and win the elections, right? And so there's going to be even more climate change denial and even less climate change action. And so now this is going to lead to even more problems, more than what we already have in the status quo, right? So we need to solve back for it right now because we're going to see major impacts in our lifetime. Okay, one more thing that you, so basically like, I'll extend some more for arguments. So you can extend the first argument about preventing civil war because their responses here don't really work. We're telling you that like a civil war is going to happen right now. The only thing stopping them is sanctions and otherwise, like Guaido and Maduro are going to face off, and there's going to be mass protests on the street, and even more people are going to be hungry, even more people are going to die, right? So also like, yeah. So they also like talk about how like, so you can also extend our impact about like U.S. interventionism being even worse, is being seen as like a good thing for the U.S. because most of the Venezuelans already hate Maduro, right? They're already in conflict with him because of like him spending government money, using paper money to buy a yacht, right? So, and sanctions are actually working to decrease the power of Maduro in the regime. Then on to our second contention about climate change, Judge. Our argument is simple. Right now, the whole world is turning away from fossil fuels and oil because we sanctioned Russia and Ukraine conflict. And as we like reduce the usage of oil, we're going to be better. We're going to be better equipped to actually solve for the impacts of climate change, right? The opponent only proliferates it, and the best way to solve for climate change is by voting neg. Okay. So a few key impacts are like, so yeah, we're already on a downward path to like, we're already on a path to stop using like fossil fuels and other things like that, right? But just allowing more oil use from Venezuela is going to once again put us dependent on oil. So the best way to move away from it and from oil and fossil fuels is by green energy. And onto the third point about politics. If the Democrats are winning now, but if the Republicans win, then we're going to see more authoritarianism, and we're going to see climate change denial, which is going to have an overall negative issue on climate change in general, and also like on the counter plan. So you can cleanly extend this because they don't have any responses for it, except that it doesn't solve in the long term. Judge, there's an issue here. First of all, they say that we don't solve in the short term because like people are going to be dying, but once we do solve for it, then they say there's no benefit in the long term. But Judge, we also solve for the long term issues because now we're preventing climate change, and climate change could be disastrous to Venezuela, right? So we're solving for both short term and long term impacts. So we weigh on impact calculus as well, right? So net benefits, we completely solve the app as they don't link to disads, right? And if you decrease sanctions, and it's going to increase Maduro's power, and it's going to hurt the people. Judge, I'll sum this down into in 2 sentences, right? If you want to solve back for climate change and oppression of the Venezuela people, you must vote AF.
Okay. Cool. So the order of my speech is just going to be reasons why you can vote opposition based on so it'll be voters, and then it'll start with the opposition case and then move on to the government. Is everyone ready? Okay, perfect. There are 4 reasons why you can cleanly vote opposition in this round. Number 1 is going to be climate change. This is the largest impact in the round because it affects literally everyone. Under their own framework of utilitarianism, climate change has the worst impacts and outweighs on magnitude. It impacts a lot more people, and it sort of acts as a catalyst for any of their impacts about things like poverty and people dying. We say climate change is going to exacerbate that and make it a lot worse. Our argument is really simple. The only way we can have a transition into renewable energy and clean green energy is if people do not have other people to turn to for oil. The reason why we have been able to keep continuing using fossil fuels is because countries like Russia and Venezuela have been supplying all of the world leaders with oil. But the problem is that right now, because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, now is uniquely key in order for us to solve back for our fossil fuel emissions. And the way that we do so is via switching to renewable energy. They try to make 2 responses. First, they tell you that we have Saudi Arabia, which means that we're still going to have this crisis with oil and we're still going to use oil. But remember what my partner says. So the Saudi government literally hung up the phone on Biden when he told him that they would not supply him with any oil. Saudi Arabia is not supplying us with oil, and they especially extended oil that compensates for Russia. And even if Saudi Arabia was supplying us with oil, that doesn't provide us with enough oil, so we're still going to be switching. Extend our arguments about how Biden specifically said that because of the Russia conflict and because there's a scarcity in oil right now, we're switching to more renewable energy, and he's investing a lot more in green tech. The second response that they make is that carbon emissions are the problem and green technology doesn't solve. But remember, green technology literally makes carbon emissions 0. Look to hydropower or nuclear power or even solar power. These do not emit carbon because we are not burning fossil fuels, which means we still solve back for climate change while they do absolutely nothing. They tell you that carbon emissions are the problem, and we agree. But the way to solve back for increasing carbon emissions is to stop burning carbon, which fossil fuels uniquely do. And the only way that countries have an incentive to switch to renewable energy is if we are on the path right now because of countries like Russia and Venezuela. But the affirmative damages the switch to renewables in 2 ways. First, by eliminating oil sanctions on Venezuela, you increase the chance that United States and other countries' investors are going to invest in Venezuelan oil because it's cheaper than Russia's right now. That means that they're going to be it's cheaper than Saudi Arabia's, for example. That means that you're going to increase the amount of consumption of carbon, and you're going to reverse the trajectory. Right now, multiple countries, even China, is trying to make a transition into green technology, which means that when you vote affirmative, you reverse that technology. Look, we win on the weighing debate. You should use what they tell you in their last speech. This round is about utilitarianism and being able to solve for the highest amount of death has the highest amount of impact. They do not give you any sort of impact calc scenario, and they don't tell you why their arguments about some people dying because of the cold outweighs climate change. Remember, like we specifically tell you that the Alaskan pipeline already exists in order to solve for like people dying from like the cold and things like that, which means that you should automatically outweigh we save more people. And even on the time frame arguments, they see that this is like a longer time away, but you should look to the fact that this is the same rhetoric we use every time we push climate change aside. We tell ourselves that the time frame is too far away for us to act now, but we tell you that now is the perfect time to act, especially since we're switching away from Russian oil. But let's move on to the reasons why we win on their case. First, an overview to their case. They have the burden to prove to you why Russia is worse than Venezuela when it comes to things like humanitarian abuses and things like that. Look at the fact that supporting any oppressor is bad, and it has a few impacts. First, it isolates all of our European allies who do not support Venezuela. When we do that, we harm the United States. And remember, they're weighing. They say what is best for the United States, or isolating all of our allies by decreasing sanctions on Venezuela is certainly not the way to continue having allies. Secondly, you should look to our counterplan. Even if they try to tell you marginal impacts on like the Venezuelan economy, look to the fact that we solve back for all of their humanitarian rights abuses, and they concede our arguments about how non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International can only enter Venezuela right now and provide people with food and resources because Maduro doesn't have power. But eliminating sanctions means Maduro gets more power. And remember, the Venezuelan government has never given the people anything such as aid, even when they needed it the most. And this is before sanctions, so they're not going to do anything. But thirdly, you should look to our third argument that goes conceded. It's the fact that oil investors in like people in like the other parts of the world are going to exploit Venezuela like they do with Kenya when you decrease sanctions. Venezuelans are not going to get the money. It's going to be American companies going into Venezuela, taking their oil like we do with imperialism and capitalism right now. They're never going to solve back for poverty. It's a clear opposition ballot.
Okay. I'll start my speech on my first. Start my time first word. Okay, Josh, I'm going to go over the main points of clash in this tournament, show you how we win, and then finally weigh and show you why it is a clear government ballot. Okay, starting with one of the main points of clash, climate change. My opponent basically weighed and patched out to the fact that they are supposed to be solving climate change. A few reasons why it's not true. One, they mentioned the fact that their whole point about the fact that Biden's policies are key to climate change is we actually turned Biden is key. Biden maintaining power, Democrats maintain power is key to having climate change policy passed. Turns to our side because we claim that Biden will only be able to maintain powers if he makes decisive decisions and is able to and actually removes these sanctions. It is widely unpopular with most central people and centrists in the United States and with most Democrats in the United States. And we have seen Biden, the main reason he's been losing support from the Democrats is because he is not decisive, meaning that the only way he can still maintain power and pass plans to solve climate change
Pause time. This argument about how Biden is like the only one that can solve for climate change and how he has to get reelected to solve for climate change is a brand new argument. It's like the extrapolation is new.
Can I respond to that? You mentioned in your member of government, member of opposition speeches that Biden Biden maintaining power is key to solving climate change, and I'm allowed to respond to that since that I am in the Prime Minister's speech.
I'll take it under consideration. Carry on, please.
Thank you. Resuming my time. I have 4 seconds with 30-second grace amount. Okay, resuming. 44 minutes. Okay, resume. So either way, so as you can see, that under that side that flows to us as well. Even if you don't buy this, a couple of reasons why climate change is actually still worse under their world. One, in the status, their impacts are mitigated by the fact that in the status quo we still buy oil from Saudi Arabia. Two, their whole point is the idea is that since we stopped buying oil from Russia, we still actually buy around 10 billion barrels. But since we've reduced our oil intake from Russia and all these countries, we're actually switching to green energy. But we have not seen this investment. Countries are scared to make the transition to green investments, meaning that we are still buying oil, we're still polluting, we still linked to climate change. Finally, as my opponent mentioned, carbon emissions are the key. Now, green energy may reduce some carbon emissions, but big polluters like companies, etc., still cause major climate change. And this is stuff that we cannot change, stuff that is still causing climate change. So it shows that climate change is still an impact. Finally, Judge, we'd implore you to weigh time frame over magnitude. The fact that in the status quo, because of increased sanctions because of increased inflation due to oil shortages, because of starvation, because of lack of social programs, you have millions of people dying in the status quo instead of impacts of climate change, which could still be mitigated in the future, which we can still change. This is not meaning that also their plan is non-unique because we can still transition from oil and into green technology. and reduce sanctions with Venezuela. So for all these reasons, their climate change impact is null. Now, moving on to the second main point of collapse, which is about Maduro's leadership and quality of life within Venezuela. Okay, their whole point I'm not going to take a lot of time to talk about the civil war point because they sort of dropped this in their final speech, but point being, they basically say that Maduro's leadership is weakened by the United States. It may be weakened internationally, but he still has hegemony and power in Venezuela, meaning that he is still able to control the country and that our sanctions are actually weakening him internally, which is what we should care about. Secondly, the fact that this actually still turns Venezuelans away from us because they could see the U.S. instead of the U.S. continuing sanctions. They might be wondering, why isn't the U.S. actually trying to reach out to us? Why isn't the U.S. actually trying to help us with social programs, etc.? Venezuelans blame the United States for the majority of the economic crisis means we still turn them away. Our impact still flows through. But moving on to their counterplan, which is about Amnesty International, a few reasons why this is not true. One, they make this false claim, the fact that social programs did not exist in Venezuela. But we have showed to you many times, under Hugo Chavez, the previous president, there was a thriving social program site within Venezuela that raised millions of people out of poverty.
Point of order. This argument about like any social programs in Venezuela under other like sort of leaders is like a brand new argument that wasn't made in any of the previous speeches, but it's up to the judge.
Okay, let me just explain. My partner clearly mentioned the fact that Venezuela did have social programs that existed before. I just simply mentioned the president that they were under, which is Hugo Chavez. They still existed under. I could also say there were Maduro's programs. This links into our first contention as well, where we talked about the fact that they are funded by petroleum. So I can, if it's okay, Judge, may I continue my speech? Okay. Either way, so we mentioned the fact that social programs already do exist in Venezuela, but they're funded by this petroleum, and they were collapsed by petroleum, meaning that we canceled these social programs due to the fact that we caused these sanctions. Meaning that we actually hurt Venezuela more, meaning that if we remove these things, we'd actually allow these social programs to come in, meaning we wouldn't need Amnesty International. Secondly, my partner clearly explained why Amnesty International and having these other non-governmental organizations actually hurts Venezuela in the long term, because it makes Venezuela non-self-sufficient and non-economically sufficient, because it's relying on this short-term aid instead of actually allowing Venezuela to grow their economy through petroleum and potentially make them more self-sufficient into the future, meaning that it's better for Venezuela to create its own social programs, fund them by itself with its own economy. And further, we mentioned this is non-unique because, yes, even though Maduro does have economic, my opponent simply say that Maduro prevents these programs from going in, but they don't really warrant this out. The fact that we do have organizations like Amnesty International, etc., in these countries already, albeit not to a huge extent, we could still implement this at the same time as removing sanctions. Okay. Finally, the main final point of clash is international relations. We would like to clarify the fact that we still buy tons of oil from Russia, and by helping Venezuela, we actually remove dollars from Russia and we help solve the war in Ukraine. This is something that my opponents have not really delinked, and its impacts still flows through. Now, weighing a couple of reasons why I should prefer our impacts. One, on time frame. Our impacts include binding maintain power in the House. They include helping thousands of Venezuelans and helping weaken the war effort in Ukraine. These are immediate impacts that save lives. You should prefer this over impacts such as climate change, because climate change is in the future. There's so many things that could still change. We could switch to green energy and still remove sanctions right now, because eventually we could phase out petroleum, etc. There are many things that could change, but in this time frame, you have millions of people dying internationally and suffering from inflation because of the sanctions we have laid on Venezuela. And by removing that, we solve all these impacts. For all these reasons, I am proud to affirm. Thank you.
Great debate.
Great debate.
Yeah, good job, y'all.
If you guys want to stick around, I'm going to figure out my decision and then I can disclose. But if y'all would prefer to go, that's totally okay. Great round, everybody. So do you guys want to stay for disclosure or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So it's probably going to take me about 10 minutes and then I'll let you guys know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Everybody's ready.
Yep, we're here.
Perfect. Is the other team here? Ridge?
Yeah, we're here.
Great.
Sorry, we're in the hallway, so we can't turn our camera on.
No worries. Okay, so ultimately, I decided to vote for the opposition on my ballot because I believe that the op is solving for the short term through their counter plan and the humanitarian efforts established under the plan that they put in place. And I also buy the op point that under Maduro's rule, if sanctions are lifted, then this humanitarian aid wouldn't be allowed simply because the government team didn't prove to me otherwise. And so I bought the ops case and their counterplan to that extent. So then under the assumption that the only input of humanitarian aid to Venezuela is from these non-government organizations, because I also bought ops government that Maduro isn't going to provide government aid, regardless of what the previous president did, which I don't view the previous president's decisions as applicable to this situation because of the corruption in Maduro's reign. So therefore, the op is solving for short-term problems of humanitarian issues, of therefore the impacts of death and harm to people. And then when we get into the discussion of long-term, we come to the whole argument about counter or climate change, which was a really big point of clash in this debate. And this did get a bit messy in the round. So just to let you guys know, we are currently getting oil from Saudi Arabia. But what the op was talking about was, I believe Saudi Arabia said that they aren't going to increase their oil supply to us, right? So I'm buying the AF government that we switch to, I'm buying the op government that we won't really switch to renewables if we have that option of increased oil. And since we don't have that option, therefore, we are going to have to make this switch to renewables. And because Saudi Arabia isn't going to be increasing their oil production, and since we're sanctioning Venezuela and Russia, I believe the claims and the impacts that accompany the claim that we'll be switching to renewables to be true, and therefore the opposition's impacts of climate change in the long term flowed through on my flow. So I think government should have fought the op's focus on climate change in this round harder. By making the whole round so focused on climate change, I think that the impacts really clearly went to the opposition here. But if the government team had perhaps emphasized other issues more throughout the round and made me believe that those should be weighted heavier, that might have won them the ballot. And so a way that we could have done that perhaps is by refuting the opposition's counterplan more. And then we could have also done that by emphasizing your guys' own contentions, such as saving lives within Venezuela. Something that I don't buy is that if we get rid of these sanctions, the Venezuelan government is going to promote humanitarian aid. They're going to kind of get better at helping their people. I don't buy that due to the corruption argument that came forth by the opposition. So for those reasons, I voted op, but you guys are both really amazing teams, and it was such a fun debate to judge. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask, but otherwise, good luck in your future rounds.
Thank you